Is retaliation coming? That's right, because according to an article here at CBS News, Democrats who investigated Trump say they expect to face arrest and retaliation if he wins the presidency. Now, once upon a time, a lot of us would have looked at this and been like, okay, whatever, that's hyperbolic political rhetoric. But right now, a lot of people are saying, yeah, you will, and you should, because after all, what you're afraid of is the very thing that you're actually doing to Donald Trump. And see, a lot of people on the right, like myself, have always warned against this kind of retaliation. But the bottom line is we're losing the argument. And we're not losing the argument because we've failed to make the appropriate one to the right. I would argue that we're losing it because the left keeps engaging in the sort of activities they currently are, and it's not just people on the right saying so. So today on Making the Argument, we're going to go through some of the predictions of what could actually happen. How did it used to be? What's the new dynamic that we're experiencing? And what might it look like if Donald Trump wins the presidency? All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. But before we get into it, I would encourage you all to go into the show notes, check out our community page in Circle. You can see the link there. Circle is one of the great opportunities that we have to be able to regularly engage with our community. In fact, a lot of the episodes that we do on Making the Argument were inspired by our members coming forward and asking us to address certain questions and topics. So go down to Circle and check that out. As always, I am your host, Nick Freitas. My beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees, is not available today. We got a lot of wedding preparations going on. No, she hasn't left me. It's my oldest daughter. And we're currently having a big debate on whether or not I have to shave my beard in order to wear the dress blues for the wedding at my daughter's request. So within the next couple of weeks, an important decision will be made on whether or not the beard has to be shaved. Now, I'm going to let you know right now, it's up to my daughter. It is her wedding, but I don't know. Advice and insight is always welcome. With me, my resident historian, political prognosticator, and mostly benevolent warlord in training, Christian Hines. How you doing, Christian?
I am doing well. How about you?
I'm doing okay. I know you are eager for this particular episode.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
When you read off the pitch to me, and I was like, oh wait, Democrats are worried that Trump might investigate or even arrest some of them if he wins. That's the whole reason I'm voting for.
Yeah, Christian's over here like, I already like him. You don't got to convince me. No, and unfortunately, our producer of producers, Nicholas Hamilton, the good Hamilton, the one that doesn't like central banking, cannot be with us today. He's actually driving back from an important meeting in Kentucky. But everyone should be back in the studio for the next episode. So let's go ahead and jump into this. So again, the headline in this article from CBS News was Democrats who investigated Trump say they expect to face arrest and retaliation if he wins the presidency. The question is this: do these guys really think that? Do they honestly believe that's what's going to happen? Or are they just engaging in the kind of fear mongering that we always see during election cycles where it's like, oh, look how brave I am. I am standing up. This is the same sort of crap that when Trump ran in 2016. And let me just let the audience know right now, Trump was not my pick in the primary in 2016. He wasn't my second choice either. I supported Rand Paul, then I supported Ted Cruz, and then I supported Donald Trump when he won the nomination. But honestly, as someone that's been kind of a lifelong conservative, libertarian-ish, I was very, very skeptical that Donald Trump was actually going to make good on any of his promises. But I knew instantly that the remarks that, oh my gosh, if Donald Trump gets into the White House, women are going to be instantly arrested and gay people are going to be put into concentration camps. Like, I knew that was all stupid. We knew that was ridiculous. Oh, he's going to start World War III. He actually did a better job than pretty much any president in my lifetime on keeping us out of wars. So I knew a lot of that was just hyperbolic rhetoric. And some people on the left believed it and other people just knew it was politically useful. And so whenever I see a headline like this, the question I always ask myself is, okay, is this the typical hyperbolic political rhetoric that we expect to see in a presidential election cycle? Or do they actually believe it? And then the most important question of all this is, and would it actually happen? Right? Because I think we can all remember the chants at Trump rallies in 2016 of lock her up. And guess what? Nobody got locked up, right? She wasn't going to get locked up. In fact, if you don't want to talk about not locking people up, Donald Trump actually had a pretty robust criminal justice reform record as president, more so than I would argue probably Barack Obama or others. So here's the question, and that's the thing that we're going to explore today, because I believe, and this is something that Christian has actually done a very good job articulating in the past on this show, that something has changed. And maybe to put it more appropriately, something's broken. Because for I would say a long time in American history, and I don't have this romantic view that once upon a time things were all beautiful and wonderful and peachy and everyone got along. That's not the case. That's never been the case in world history. But I would say that more so in the United States than probably anywhere else in the world of any sort of like major country, which is as diverse and as expansive and as powerful as the United States. We just don't lock up our political prisoner or our political opponents. We don't lock them up. We don't use the full force of government to investigate and attempt to destroy them. You do that in the election cycle, right? And when the election's over, well, then that part's kind of over too. And it's always been kind of this joke that everyone stands up and talks about how horrible and evil and the other person is. But then when the election cycle is over, we kind of go back to a more normalized form of rhetoric where we all understand that, hey, we're all Americans. We got some different ideas on how we get. That is not the case anymore. I mean, can we just admit that? That's just not the case anymore. The sort of frustrations that we see, the sort of anger that we see is a lot more deep-seated. And we've explained it before by saying, well, the difference is when you disagree on not only where you want the country to go, but you actually disagree on where the country's been, when you disagree on whether or not the country is even good in the first place, when you disagree on whether or not the founding principles which established the country were noble or not, this is a fundamental split in American identity. And so now you effectively have a rather sizable portion of the U.S. population, especially within some of those most culturally shaping institutions like academia, the media, Hollywood, who have a very, very different view of America and a very, very different view of where we should go. And it's somewhat diametrically opposed at this point. When half the country doesn't want to live in the same country as the other half, you have something of an existential crisis. And right now that existential crisis has been largely philosophical and electoral. But what we're seeing now is that it's moving into what some people have dubbed lawfare. The idea of they're going to use every apparatus available to them within the state to not only prop up their allies, but to actually deliberately go after and punish their political opponents. And while this is not completely unheard of within American history or American politics, it has usually been rather frowned upon. And even if there were, extreme desperate times call for desperate measures, historians usually have the better sense to look back on it and say, yeah, that wasn't appropriate, right? John Adams is not, well thought of for his signing of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Woodrow Wilson is not well thought of with respect to locking up his political opponents during World War I. And you see other similar instances, but now more and more there is an increasing level of acceptance on both sides for this sort of behavior. And I will argue that, again, people like me that have regularly argued that this is not healthy, this is not good. You can't use the Ring of Power against Sauron, right? You got to destroy the ring. A lot more people are looking back at me and like, well, that's great, Nick, but the ring doesn't get destroyed. There is no Mount Doom. There is no end where the Hobbit throws it in, right? That doesn't exist. It's going to be there. And now the question is who's going to wield that power and to what end? And what has been shocking to me is when I look at the Twitter response to this article in CBS News, I don't see a ton of people going, this is ridiculous, this is hyperbolic. I see a lot more people now saying, not only do I want this to happen, but I fully expect it to and demand that it does. And now when you've got both sides of the aisle essentially saying, yeah, lock them up or lock her up or whatever it is, and now it's not just hyperbole, they mean it. What does that mean for the country? So let's kind of jump in first to this idea of how it used to be in American politics. And so we've already said that obviously there were cases, again, anybody that has this view that, oh gosh, the founders all got along wonderfully. Like you need to go, like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams used to be really great friends. They were allies all throughout the process of the First Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress. They worked in conjunction with one another to fight for independence, especially against states like Pennsylvania, South Carolina, New York, which were a lot more hesitant. Dickinson from Pennsylvania wasn't down with this idea. South Carolina and many states in the South were in opposition to independence initially. And here's John Adams from Massachusetts and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, along with several others, working together toward it. And then following, independence, they were still considered somewhat on the same side. John Adams serving as vice president. You had Thomas Jefferson serving as Secretary of State. And then you start to see this division taking place between Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson and the Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, over the proper role of the federal government. And they both bought their own newspapers and they just eviscerated one another. And then when Adams became president and Jefferson became vice president, because at that time, the second biggest getter of the electoral votes was automatically vice president, it was brutal. Like, it was brutal between two people that used to have been really, really good friends. And then when the Alien Sedition Act was signed by John Adams, that was one where you saw stringent restrictions on freedom of movement, freedom of speech. So the point I want to, lay out here is that from the earliest time within American history, there have been cases where things like this went into effect, went into law, where people that used to be good friends became bitter enemies. But almost immediately, people thought better of it or recognized the problems with it. There's a reason why John Adams just rush out and sign this and brag about it. He was conflicted over it. And later on in his life, he was very conflicted over it. So it's happened before. We saw it again with the Civil War, obviously with Abraham Lincoln, the suspending of habeas corpus. World War I was, I think, one of the most egregious instances of, again, a U.S. president just saying, hey, I don't like what you're writing in your paper, and that's seditious, so now I'm going to lock you up for it. You had Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II saying, we're going to take an entire group of people based off of their ancestry and put them into concentration camps because we don't trust Japan. And so therefore we don't trust a lot of our American citizens of Japanese ancestry, even though one of the most valiant units in World War II was comprised of Japanese, American soldiers of Japanese ancestry. So this has happened before. The question is this a new dynamic? Is this truly a break from what we've seen in other times in American history? Is it a new manifestation?
I would say yes.
Okay.
And the
why?
reason why is because all of the examples that you've listed, with the exception of the first one, we were in a state of war, right? There was the Civil War, World War I, World War II. I don't care what people have to say. Jerry Connolly is incorrect when he says that our border is the Ukraine-Russian border. Right. We are not currently in a state of war, despite the fact that we're constantly being gaslit into believing that we are currently at war in the Middle East or currently at war in Ukraine. The United States is not, although we certainly are supportive more towards one side than the other in those two conflicts.
Yeah.
And so I think the thing that separates where we are right now versus these other historical examples that you've listed, with the exception being the first one, is that we're not in a state of war. There's no civil war going on yet. There's no world war going on yet. Hopefully ever, right? And so these instances that you've brought up are really, extraordinary circumstances that led to people picking really hard decisions, and ones that we pick apart today. And I think rightfully so. I heavily criticize what Lincoln did with habeas corpus. I heavily criticize what Wilson did and what FDR did with jailing political opponents or jailing people based on ethnicity or anything like that. But the excuse that was given at the time, and we can say it's an excuse, right?
Yeah.
But the excuse that was given at the time is, these are measures because the United States is at war.
And let me just back up real quickly. Even in the first instance, there was essentially, we were on the verge of being drawn into a war in Europe all the way back during Adams' presidency. This is where you saw huge fights between the English and the French, the Jeffersonians, the Hamiltonians on again, what was the U.S. position within that conflict going to be? And so even then, even though we weren't officially out in a war at that time, war was looming, and that heavily influenced Adams' decision, because the French Revolution had been trying to get, or elements of the French Revolution had been trying to get the United States to come in and participate on the side of the French very early on.
Yeah. And even in the first instance, keep in mind that Adams and Jefferson hated each other in the election of 1800. I mean, go look at what they said about each other in that election. But after that was over, and after Jefferson's presidency, they actually came back together again. They reconciled later in life. In fact, Adams' last words, because they both died on the same day as well, Adams' last words were talking about Thomas Jefferson,
Yeah, Jefferson
who had died
survives.
earlier that morning.
Yeah.
So he was actually incorrect with saying
Yeah.
Jefferson lives. But like, there's something to be said about how the founding fathers disagreed vehemently in many cases. I mean, Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton, right?
Yeah.
The founding fathers disagreed vehemently about many things, but they also agreed on many things as well. Even those who had supposedly diametrically opposed worldviews, right? Like somebody like Hamilton and Burr, or Hamilton and Jefferson, or keep in mind that like Madison was a member of the Federalists, but then later on in life became more associated with the Republicans, and then in his presidency kind of veered slightly back into the Federalist mold, despite being elected as a Jeffersonian Republican. Like he rechartered the bank, for example. And so it's worth noting that, yes, they disagreed vehemently, but there was still a shared common set of goals and principles that they all had, because they all fought together to get the independence of this country from the British Crown. And with the exception of maybe Hamilton, very few of them wanted a return to a monarchy, right? And so they had a shared worldview. They had a shared mission statement, right? And so even though they disagreed about specific points, even though they disagreed about specific policies, there was a shared vision, a shared purpose, a shared goal, a shared mission statement that kind of encompassed all of them.
Yeah.
And that shined through in certain moments. We do not currently have that. And so I think that it is true that this time is different. I think it's different certainly from the World Wars and the Civil War, but I also think it's different from the founding of this country. I think that we are living in uncharted waters because, and it's something that you've told me, we don't even agree on what the facts are.
Yeah.
Let alone where we want to go.
We don't even agree that facts exist in the same way that we used to believe facts existed. And in fact, facts can be quite racist now if they disagree with whatever the objectives are of certain elements with the left. And we've talked before about how, okay, well, when you can't agree that there's such a thing as objective truth, and you can't agree that there's such a thing as objective morality, well, then what are you left with? Well, you're left with one side dominating over the other side. And people find ways to justify the most heinous acts imaginable if it means that they're going to win, because the alternative to them not winning is them being oppressed by somebody else. And so no, I think you're right. I think as different as Hamilton's vision was from Jefferson's vision of the United States, both of them believed in the underlying nobility and justness of the existence of the United States, of the fundamental principles which were expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And they both believed in wanting the further greatness of the United States. They had disagreements on whether or not you were going to have an elected monarch or whether or not you were going to go through a process that was more, small rural agrarian or whatever else.
Or a central bank.
Yeah. Should you have a central bank? Should you not have a central bank? But neither one of them believed that, we need to have a central bank to overthrow the evil patriarchy that, set up. And that's what you're talking about now. And again, this is where it would have been there was very robust debates going on about theology and about truth and about philosophy at the time of the founders. The difference is that there wasn't a whole lot of disagreement in the existence of objective truth, reality, and morality. And so you could make a good argument as to why which one, why which particular belief system was superior, but everyone kind of agreed that there was objective measures by which those things could be judged. And when you enter into a new realm of postmodernism, which rejects meta-narratives, right, rejects the idea of objective truth, when you have kind of this neo-Marxist view of separating everyone by oppressor and oppressed, and the critical theory component of that, combined with this hyper-secular Haslow's hierarchy of needs and collectivism, these things are not reconcilable, right? Like Hamilton could lose his bid for wanting a lifetime. He wanted a president that was elected that served a life term, right? He lost that debate. He didn't believe that therefore America was horrible and an ugly place that was unfair and oppressive.
And he didn't try to arrest his political opponents and seize power or anything like that.
Yeah.
He rolled with the punches and just fought the next fight, because ultimately I think a simple way to describe this is that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, to just take two examples of people that had vehement disagreements during this time period, there was more in common between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in terms of worldview and vision for the country than there is between us and the left today.
Yeah.
easily more in common.
Well, and that's and again, that's one of the things, because we have this, we did a whole episode on this. So diversity is our strength. Diversity is our strength. Well, no, unity is actually your strength. What it is you need unity of purpose with diversity of capabilities and perspective. But if the diverse attributes of your society are not working together, at least in some towards some common goal or understanding of reality, then that diversity is going to cause conflict. And I'm not saying anything revolutionary here. That's just, and understand that unity doesn't mean that the collective is working together toward a single purpose. The unity within the United States was generally built upon the idea that no, you as an individual get to determine what sort of goals you're going to work to. And that's what we're unified around, is that you as an individual get to live your life the way you want, provided you don't infringe on rights of others to do the same. Well, now if we don't agree on that anymore, okay, then what is the unifying purpose behind the country? And arguably, we're struggling to find one right now. And that's really problematic. But if you want, and this is why it's so incredible to have stuff that you can truly rally behind. And I know for me, that's good steak, right? If you can rally behind good steak, it's really hard to be upset and angry with another person when you are enjoying a meal together and breaking bread. And Good Ranchers makes that possible for everyone in America. In fact, if you go to goodranchers.com, put in promo code Nick, they're going to give you a special deal right now where if you sign up for one of the subscriptions, you're going to get locked into the price today all the way to 2026. That's a great deal. That is what they call their price shield, right? They're inflation-proof poultry, beef, pork, wild-caught seafood, you name it. Anything that you would want to put on the table to be able to have a healthy, wonderful discussion with another human being is right there, brought to you, sent to your door by Good Ranchers. GoodRanchers.com, promo code Nick. Sign up right now for that subscription. You're going to get that price shield locked into it all the way to 2026. What a deal, right? Breaking bread, really, really important. GoodRanchers.com, check that out. All right. So let's talk about
good ad transition.
Yeah, let's talk about that kind of that new dynamic. So if we've kind of, I think most people on the right. So again, let's back up a little bit historically. Everybody now kind of looking back at J. Edgar Hoover's FBI during things like the Civil Rights Movement and the fact that the FBI was regularly investigating people not for criminal acts, but investigating people that they thought were, a danger to the state or whatever. We look at a lot of that now and we say, okay, yeah, some of this was just like horrific, just horrible violations of privacy and what we would consider to be the role of a legitimate law enforcement organization. Well, now I think we're at a point where like half the country feels as if, yeah, law enforcement, at least at the federal level, is going to be utilized in such a way as to punish me for what I think and what I believe. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that everyone's living in fear of the FBI showing up to their door one day. What it really means is that anybody that stands up a little bit too tall or says something that they shouldn't, right, they're going to get hit down. They're going to get knocked down. And Trump has been something of a personification of this. And I think the left feels completely morally justified in going against Donald Trump because, one, let's face it, if we're being honest, he has kind of a shady personal life, right? The stuff with, Stormy Daniels, the stuff with, previous wife. It's not a stretch for anyone to believe that Donald Trump got involved in a relationship outside of marriage that he shouldn't have, right? And then possibly wanted to cover it up, right? That doesn't really shock anyone. The business dealings side, right? I think people look at that and they're like, well, I'm sure that there's business dealings that took place. The question is were they illegal? Did somebody actually get hurt? Well, that's not the question for the left. The question for the left is there any way that we can utilize this to hurt Donald Trump as much as possible? And the same sort of, legal tools they would never dream of using against some of their biggest donors that have absolutely engaged in, business practices, probably far more questionable than anything happened with this real estate deal where the bank itself was like, we like Donald Trump as a customer and we did our own assessment. I mean, that was always the concept right here, that when it comes to like loans by banks, the bank is the one conducting the investigation because they're the ones on the hook if the loan fails. And now the government has just inserted itself into a case that is just absurd and said, no, we're going to decide whether or not we think the bank did the right thing. Did the bank lose any money? Well, no, they made money. Oh, did the clients lose any money? No, they made money too. Okay, was anybody hurt by this transaction at all? Well, no, but we don't think he was very honest with how much Mar-a-Lago was actually worth as leverage for this loan. Okay, great. I'm glad you don't think that. And if you were the loan officer at a bank, you really could have made an impactful decision with respect to that loan being issued. But you're not, and this isn't your job, so what are you doing?
I mean, as I told you before we started recording, like, who are these people to determine what the value of Donald Trump's assets are? The marketplace determines the value of what Donald Trump's assets are. And it, quite frankly, doesn't matter what Donald Trump values them at. It determines at what a potential buyer or creditor would value them at. Not the government. That's the whole point of free market capitalism. It doesn't matter at all what he thinks the value is any more than it matters what the government is. It matters what the marketplace thinks it is. And for the state to then come after him by alleging that he overinflated the value of his assets, first off, how does that hurt anybody? Second off, who are you to determine what the value of the assets are? Yeah. I think that this whole trial that's currently taking place about the value of his assets is, I think, a perfect example of how the justice system has been just overtly weaponized against people that are ideological opponents of the ruling regime. There used to be a point in time, and I told you this right before we started recording, there used to be a point in time where I thought anybody that used the phrase deep state or anything like that, like in 2016, 17, 18, I thought to myself, anybody using the phrase deep state was an idiot. No, I was the idiot. The deep state is real. And I feel like a fool for not recognizing it until like 4 or 5 years after the fact that it was obvious that there was such a thing. It should have been clear, actually, if you think about it, when the Mueller investigation began, that there was something afoot. Because that entire thing occupied, 2+ years of his presidency. And what did they determine? There was no collusion. There was nothing even remotely close to collusion. And I worked in political marketing at the time. You know what the Russians were actually doing? The Russians were creating some bots on Facebook and buying $100,000 worth of cheap Facebook ads in order to influence the outcome of the election. I'm sorry, $100,000 worth of Facebook ads is going to change
nothing.
5 votes, maybe.
Yeah,
like you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar presidential election, and what the Russians are basically doing is 4chan posting.
Yeah,
they're funding 4chan operations, is what they're doing, and we're supposed to believe that is somehow, first off, changing the outcome of the election, and second off, that there was some sort of collusion. There was no collusion. There's no doubt that the Russians were engaging in election interference, but the degree to which they were successful in actually doing anything is minuscule. When you consider what they were actually spending money on and what was uncovered. And then to add to the idea, I mean, if you poll Democrats today, a majority of Democrats will say that vote tallies were changed.
Yeah.
That, like, again, ballots were altered.
Yeah.
Which is really funny because then they turn around and say that we're election deniers or conspiracy theorists when anybody has any objection to the way that 2020 was run about. These people are the ultimate projection artists at the end of the day. They accuse the right of that which they are guilty of, or at least guilty of doing first. And then when the right does the same thing in response, then they cry foul and they say, oh, look at how, look at how extreme these people are. Brother, you opened the can of worms. Like, for example, going to the 2020 election results and the entire uproar over certifying elections. Democrats were doing the exact same thing in 2000. They were doing the exact same thing in 2004. It was Democrats that tried to prevent Florida's certification in 2000. It was Democrats that tried to prevent the certification of Ohio's electoral votes in 2004. It was Democrats that did lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit in order to prevent the outcome of those 2 elections from taking place the way that they did, and then cried uproar and said these are illegitimate presidents, that George Bush didn't actually win twice.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that he won the popular vote the second time. And then they have the gall to then go around and say that we're a threat to democracy. So it was a threat to democracy when it was Republicans that were upset about the fact that laws in many of these states changed months before the election in order to facilitate mail-in voting, which is, I mean, say whatever you want, but there's actually something you can point to there and say, hey, there was a way in which we changed how elections are normally done. You could say it was because of COVID or whatever, but there was a change that took place. Now, you could still say that's still totally legitimate, but it's also true that we changed the way that it was done. But then your same party 20 years ago, there was no change in the way that the elections were done in 2004. You were just upset that you lost the swing state that determined the outcome of the presidency, and you didn't want to certify it. and you had multiple members in Congress who voted against certifying it. That's totally excusable. That's defending democracy. But then when the right has the same type of objections, arguably a more valid objections, no, you want to paint them as a threat to democracy. Well, eventually the right's going to determine your understanding of democracy is the only way that we can have more democracy is if you retain political power in perpetuity forever. That's not what democracy is. That is not what democracy is. Democracy is you accept the idea that you might lose one day.
Well,
and they're incapable of accepting the idea that they could ever lose.
Well, I think that, I mean, let's accept this much, right? Obviously, we understand we live in a constitutional republic. That constitutional republic makes use of democratic processes for the election of representatives, and then those representatives make use of democratic processes for the passage of laws, et cetera, et cetera. But to your point, yeah, this has always been the issue. It's not that there aren't, people on the right that have made ridiculous accusations in the past or want to pass off every single election victory as fraud or election defeat as fraud or whatever it is. Yeah, that happens, right? There's always sour grapes at the end of the day. The part that has gotten so frustrating to the right is once again, it's always different when they do it. When they do it, I'll give you a perfect example of this. Back in 2018, I got into a little bit of a kerfluffle, with some of my Democratic colleagues on the floor over the gun issue. And I remember one of my colleagues, because I had mentioned that, one of my colleagues had brought up that, she had a school teacher in her district that said, this is an issue between guns or my life. And I said, that's a false dilemma. You're creating a false dilemma in order to achieve your political objectives. And this delegate, who I actually respect quite a bit, very, very nice woman, she comes over and she goes, Nick, I don't appreciate you bringing that up in the context that you did. I said, well, I think it was relevant to what I was saying. She goes, well, Nick, you don't understand. She was just speaking from a position of passion and concern. I said, oh, so you want me to view it differently because she was speaking from a position of passion and concern? She goes, yes. I said, okay, good. I'm speaking from a position of passion and concern, so I want you to view what I said differently. And she looked at me and she goes, okay, I see what you're saying. She's no longer in office. Honestly, I'm not sure if she would have won re-election, not because she wasn't an effective legislator, but because that sort of ability to say, oh, I get what you're saying there. There's a potential contradiction in the way I interpreted this. That's not acceptable in the Democratic Party anymore. You will just go along with what the party says to believe. And you will vote appropriately and you will behave appropriately because it's not whether or not there was a contradiction doesn't matter. Right? I just had another issue on the floor where we had actually had a pretty civil floor debate going on until a couple of my colleagues got up and decided that, nope, we're going to go back to, if you don't agree with us, you're mean, you're evil, you're greedy, you're horrible, you want people to die. And I said, you know what? I don't care anymore. I said it right there on the floor. I said, I just don't care about your accusations anymore because I know this is political posturing. And one of the ways I know it's political posturing is because the moment one of us dares to even slightly push back, you immediately play the victim. Like, oh my gosh, how dare, why are you being so divisive? What about decorum? What about civil discourse? Like 5 seconds ago, you were comparing me to a Nazi. And I said, hey, I don't think you should do that. And the moment I say, hey, I don't think you should do that, you're like, oh, why are you yelling at me? Like, shut up. Shut up. You see, it wasn't the hyperbolic language that convinced me that this was all garbage. What convinced me it was all garbage was the moment I came back with any sort of response, you immediately appealed to the sense of civil dialogue and decorum and getting along and common understanding and not questioning one's intentions, right? You're full of crap. And the problem is that if I operate the way you're demanding when you get upset with what I say, if I go back to operate, oh, okay, all right, good. You've acknowledged that we shouldn't be questioning each other's intentions. We should be engaging in civil dialogue. If I go back to operating that, you will immediately flip the switch and go right back to attacking me again. So you want a dynamic, you want a world where I have to fight by all the little rules that have been established for centuries now. But you can fight however you want. You can find the little advantages by doing your little hit and runs. You can do your little roadside bombs, and I'm just supposed to put up with it. Because the moment I engage in anything resembling a similar tactic, you're going to say, oh my gosh, how dare you? I thought you were better than that. Like, nope. See, that's the problem. You only get to do that so long before the other side starts to say, you know what? If these are the new rules of the game, I guess it's time to start playing by them.
Somebody needs to articulate, and I'm probably not the best person to do it, but I'm going to give it a try. Somebody needs to articulate what exactly is going on here. And what I mean is that there's a set process that is going to eventually lead to catastrophe.
Yeah.
And it starts with the right notices that the left is doing something that is incredibly hypocritical or self-destructive or contradictory, right? And then they voice an objection to it. And then the left's response is excuse-making, projection in many cases, or attacking the opposition and then saying, oh, well, it's because you're evil or you're bad, and that's the reason we're acting this way.
Oh, here's what, okay, so the question is when most people do that, your immediate response is, okay, you're being a bully that was picking on somebody, and as soon as you got popped in the face, you ran to the teacher crying, I have no sympathy for you. Why is it that they keep getting sympathy for these sort of obvious contradictions? And the reason why is because you will notice that the moment that flip comes, so they're going to attack you, they're going to attack you, they're going to attack you. The moment you step up and you attack back, they immediately make whatever, like you attacked what they said about you. That's not what they defend. They immediately hold up some sort of vulnerable party that you never attacked, and then they put themselves in between you and that vulnerable party and say, we're just protecting this. We're just protecting marginalized groups. We're just protecting these poor, vulnerable people that have no one to defend or stand up for them against you. Like, I wasn't attacking that person. I was attacking what you did over here. Oh, sure, that's what you say. But this is what you really want to do. And we're here to defend them against you. Because once again, it's reinforcing this narrative that you're not wrong on policy, and you're not honest, and you can't be trusted, and you're a big, mean, evil person that has all this power, even when you're in the minority, right? And if it wasn't for them standing up against you, right, this person would get hurt. And that's what they do. And it's a very compelling narrative, especially when you have the press and the media and higher academia and higher ed all reinforcing that, oh yeah, this is the proper way to interpret what just happened, right? It's not that they got caught in engaging in something that was intellectually dishonest or just completely false. It's not that they got caught engaging in the same sort of blatant hyperbolic rhetoric that they accuse everybody else of. No. They were just being very, very passionate in their defense of this innocent person against you. You're still the bad guy. You're always the bad guy. And it doesn't matter what evidence you bring. It doesn't matter if you display any sort of passion toward, no. You're the bad guy. And the people you represent are also the bad guys. And so we can treat you with this level of contempt. We can treat you with this level of dismissive hatred because after all, you stand for everything evil, whereas we are merely standing in the way of you hurting whoever this marginalized person is right here, whoever this demonstration of vulnerability is, right? And that strategy has been working. And the problem is that because the right has not figured out how to, attack that strategy itself, then what ends up happening, and in part, let's be fair, the right is also fighting against, again, culturally shaping institutions which have bought into the narrative on this. The end result is the right is saying, well, look, I can't continue to engage in a fight with somebody that is not going to fight fair, that is not going to be honest, that thinks I'm evil, that doesn't really want to coexist with me. They either want me to obey or to shut up, and I'm not willing to do either. And we can't have a debate because we no longer agree on the terms of what reality or morality actually look like in a group setting. So what does that leave me with? Well, it leaves me with fighting back hard or losing. I don't want to lose.
And part of I mean, if the choice is between winning and losing, then you fight to win.
Yeah.
Because it's increasingly not about how do we find a way to coexist or compromise. We've learned that every time we seek coexistence and compromise, and the right has sought coexistence and compromise too often, actually, and every time they do that, we somehow lose. Why is it that every compromise involves us giving up something and them getting half of what they demand?
Yeah.
Right? It's the analogy of somebody wants to burn down my house and we compromise and they only burn down my garage. And then they come back next time and then they only burn down my living room. Well, sooner or later, my whole house gets burned down. I mean, what it is, you know what it is? It's Hegelian dialectics.
Yes.
Applied in a political electoral sense.
Let's explain that real quick. So what Hegelian dialectics is, and again, there's going to be people that explain this much better than I do, but you have the synthesis and the antithesis, right? So you have two things which are ostensibly the opposite of one another, right? And then there's a compromise in between those two things. Right, no, it's the thesis and the
It's the thesis and antithesis,
thesis
and then there's a
the
synthesis.
That's the compromise between the two things. Well, the way that the left works with Hegelian dialectics is whatever compromise they get, right, is the compromise favorable to them, but then that becomes the new extreme, right? Whatever synthesis they got before becomes the new extreme that they're now fighting against. And so that's how they continually pull you to the left, because every compromise you make now becomes the default right-wing position. And then they pull you far to the left. So what happens? Every compromise goes toward the left.
And the right is slowly, they're still not there yet, as evidenced by the recent votes that were taken where we spent $100 billion on foreign aid without a single penny for securing our own southern border. Although, you know what? If this had taken place 15, 20 years ago, the overwhelming majority of Republicans would have voted for it. At least now, technically a majority of Republicans voted against that bill.
Yeah.
Although it was nowhere near an overwhelming majority, right? So I think slowly the right is starting to understand, oh, this is how the game is played, and we're not going to play by your rules. But unfortunately, we're still not there yet. The right is still operating in this default, we're just supposed to be the loyal opposition mode, rather than, no, you need to fight to win. And I think that part of the problem is going back where I said like somebody needs to like lay out what exactly is going on here. The left demands something. They act in a certain way in order to get it. Any way in order to get it. There is no like correct way to go about getting a policy. Whatever gets you the end state is totally acceptable discourse. Again, this is how you get queers for Palestine.
Yeah.
Right? Like it doesn't matter if if we think there's a contradiction. There is no contradiction because it's all in pursuit of power. So it's actually consistent because it's consistent insofar as they're seeking a consistent goal. The unifying objective of all left-wing action is, how do we accumulate political power? Whatever mechanisms we need in order to get to that endpoint is acceptable. So it is actually consistent. We think it's inconsistent because within our framework and our worldview and our operation of morality and logic and reason, we think these things are inconsistent. How can you champion LGBTQ whatever and then also say, oh yeah, I think Hamas are the good guys here?
Yeah.
We think there's a contradiction there. There is no contradiction because the end goal is what's consistent. The end goal is seeking power. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to leverage any movement in order to do it. A good example of this is, look at how the left used to treat the white working class.
Yeah.
For a long time, they were the champions of the white working class. Obama won Michigan by like 15 points in 2008. He won Wisconsin by over 10 points in 2008. He won Pennsylvania in a landslide. The upper Midwest that used to be the heartland of the white working class, the Rust Belt basically, right? Democrats performed very strong there not that long ago, less than 20 years ago, 15 years ago even. And if you go back into the 80s and 90s, like those were very, very strong blue-collar union, landscapes that voted heavily for Democrats. The Democrats presented themselves for a long time as the party of the working man because they thought that was the way that you achieve political power. You appeal to the working classes and you win, right?
Well, that was kind of the Marxist dynamic.
Well, and also the socialist dynamic too.
Yeah.
Not that I think that the Democrats in the 1980s were all Marxists.
No, I don't
right?
either. Yeah.
But you're right that there is an overlap with Marxism there. But I don't think that Walter Mondale was just a closet Marx. I think he was definitely a socialist, but or at least a closet socialist. But I don't think that he was necessarily reading theory.
Yeah.
But the point is that for a long time, the Democratic Party championed itself as being the party of the working man. And then what happened? Look at how they treat white working class voters today. There's a reason that Trump won in 2016 and almost won in 2020 and might win this year, in part because voters in those states are in open rebellion against the Democratic Party, despite being literally making the core of the Democratic coalition one generation ago, let alone 2 or 3 generations ago.
Yeah.
And what this is indicative of is that there was a group of people that the Democrats thought, this is our ticket to political power. We will hold them up as being champions of these people. And then over time, they decided, you know what? That's actually not the path in order to obtain political power. This is the path in order to obtain political power. And so now we're going to discard these people and treat them like the scum of the earth. You're currently seeing, and I don't think we're going to see the results of this potentially for decades or even generations, because the same process that took place with the Democrats discarding the white working class might take place with Jewish Americans, right? For a long time, the Democrats were the party of Jewish Americans, and polls still show that they are. But we're starting to see in public discourse, things are starting to change, at least with some people.
Yeah.
Not with all of them, but there's some Jewish Americans that were loyal Democrats that are starting to question, well, maybe the Democrats aren't the party for me because look at what happened after October 7th. Look at what's currently happening in Columbia University right now. These are all Democrat activists, left-wing activists that are doing this type of stuff. And so for a long time, Democrats held up Jewish Americans in the same way that they held up white working class. This is our ticket in order to obtain political power. We're going to rally around this voting block, monopolize it, and then use it as a path forward in order to obtain political power. And then guess what? They discarded one, and now they're starting to discard the other one. They might not fully discard it, but they're embracing violence against a group of people now because they think that it's a path to political power. And so the same thing that happened to white working class voters will happen to you. You know what? It's currently happening to old school feminists like J.K. Rowling.
Yeah.
It's happened to some atheists that weren't atheists because they were just militant atheists and hated religion, but I mean like the ones that were working in biology, like Brett Weinstein and stuff like that, that their objections to religion might have been different than the militant atheists. And now some of them are realizing actually, there was actually a reason that there's a religious impulse that exists within society, and that's going to be filled in some way. And we thought that if you eradicate religion, that everybody's just going to become enlightened, materialists. No, they're not. They're going to become a bunch of tribalistic, pseudo-religious cult followers, and that's what's replaced traditional Christianity. And so now people like Weinstein and even Richard Dawkins, we did an episode on this recently, are kind of like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Well, it's because the revolution's discarded you. The revolution will discard everybody.
Yeah.
And what's happening is that each new generation of people that are fueling the left-wing revolution are now finding themselves being cast aside once they're no longer serving any purpose. And if you're on the right, you're sitting there watching just the train fly off the rails. And at some point, you have to realize you can't compromise with these people. And you know what? You can't even coexist with these people because they demand a world in which you are utterly crushed. How can you have more democracy in a system where the people that you're negotiating with demand your absolute submission? And if you don't give it to them, they will utterly destroy you. At that point, it's not just get along to go along. Let's find a way to coexist. Let's find a way to compromise. No. Their definition of compromise is we will destroy you and everything that you hold to be dear and true and beautiful and just and worthy of living.
Well, and let me say this, because there's going to be some people look at this and be like, okay, now you guys are the ones being hyperbolic. My next door neighbor who's a Democrat and who's not a crazy person is nothing like what you've just described. And that's probably true, right? That's probably true. I know a lot of people that, hey, look, they're a little bit more left of center and they just don't really care about a lot of this stuff on politics. It's just, they were raised Democrats and they generally have this feeling that, hey, don't pick on people, and yeah, we should help out people that are hurting. And yeah, Putin's a bad guy, right? Like, so it's this kind of casual commitment to a bunch of ideas that honestly, if all you've ever heard is kind of one notion of it, and then all you've heard of the right is the caricature of the right, well then, yeah, you don't want to be associated with that. You want to be associated with the people that are trying to help people that need it, right? Here's the problem. And again, I see this serving in a legislative body. Again, this latest dust up I had on the floor during the floor debate, I had a Democrat that I've debated with before. He came over and he goes, hey, I wasn't saying, I said, no, I said, you've never been the problem. Because anytime he gets up and debates on the floor, he does a very, very worthwhile job of explaining what his goals are. He never lies. He has a commitment to this idea of objective truth. We may disagree with respect to our perspectives or processes, but he has a commitment to it. And I'm looking at this guy and I'm thinking, you're not going to be acceptable to your own party here sooner than you think. And the reason for that is because you are thinking that, okay, yeah, there's some crazies here, but we've got some goals. And again, I want to help people that I think need the help. And I think this is the way to do it. At some point, they're going to force you to cross a line you're not willing to cross. And you're thinking in your head, yeah, but for decades now, I have fought on behalf of all these things. Surely you recognize that I'm still one of the good guys. Nope, you're a reactionary. That's what you're going to be, man. Like sooner or later, that is what you're going to be. And you're seeing guys like Bill Maher and Anna Kasparian and some of these others. We had a whole episode where we talked about this, where more and more they're starting to realize, well, no, I'm fine with all of that. The left left me. And it's like, you don't understand. There was always a philosophical underpinning to what you were going for that was never going to let you occupy this area of compromise and okay, yeah, there is objective truth and objective reality and certain things we've just got to understand, or parts of human nature. That was never going to happen, man. Now I will say this, as we look at this new dynamic where we have, again, two worldviews that really are legitimately philosophically diametrically opposed, and the left is increasingly comfortable with using government power. And I want to make sure people understand what I'm saying here. This has been going on for a while. And here's what I mean by that. If you look at the way that the Democrats budget, right? Now, I want you to, if you're a Democrat and you're watching this, if you're someone left of center, you're watching this, you probably know I'm very, very pro Second Amendment rights. We have Article 1, Section 13 in Virginia. I believe that responsible citizens should be able to own a firearm, to be able to protect themselves, protect their country, everything. Maybe you think that's crazy, maybe you don't, whatever. Do you know how much money that I have voted to send toward pro-gun organizations? Zero. In fact, if someone brought a bill and said, hey, we want to give tax money to the NRA or to Gun Owners of America or to National Association of Gun Rights in order to advocate, I would say, no, that's not the appropriate role for government. I shouldn't be taking money from my taxpayers in order to give it to these organizations to do X, Y, and Z. Do you know how many organizations Democrats fund that are essentially going out there and operating in some way as just a wing of the Democratic Party? Whether it's public sector employee unions, whether it is the abortion industry, whether at this point higher ed. We're giving hundreds of in Virginia. One of the biggest debates we had over the budget was Democrats bragging about how much money they were giving to higher education. Now, you may be saying, well, Nick, that's a neutral institution. No, it isn't. It is absolutely not a neutral institution. And you could even see in the way that they tried to affect the budget for things like tuition assistance grants. So they didn't want tuition assistance grants going to certain private entities. What's the largest private university in Virginia that gets tuition assistance grants? Liberty. Yeah, they tried to set it up to where they could increase the amount of money that was available for higher education, but it couldn't go to institutions that they knew were far more likely to not be on board with their narrative. They are using our tax dollars to fund their ideological allies in a way that, quite frankly, the right does not do. Now, that's not all-encompassing. There are definitely members on the right that will try to funnel money and subsidization to various organizations. And they may even be organizations that tend to be more in line with getting Republicans elected, right? So you could say, well, what about this money that goes to the sugar industry in Florida that then goes to, Republican campaign funds? You need to understand a lot of those organizations, they will donate to whatever candidate, right, is going to make sure that their subsidy keeps coming. It's still bad. It's still wrong. It shouldn't happen. But that's what's going on there. No. I'm talking about the deliberate funding of ideologically based organizations and institutions, largely for the purpose of either donating money back or creating activists. That's nuts. And there is no right-wing equivalent that even comes close to that on this sort of direct subsidization. So this has been going on for a while where it's been like, yeah, we're going to use the government as a tool to fund the organizations that we like. Then it prominently became, we're also going to use the government as a mechanism to go after and to hurt or to at least delay and obstruct the organizations we do not. You saw this under the Obama administration when you had conservative, 401, what am I thinking?
401ks?
Yeah, 501c 501c4s. 501c4s try to come up like nonprofit organizations where they were deliberately being slow rolled within the Obama administration. Then you saw the same thing going on with respect to certain government agencies colluding with big tech in order to shut down, deplatform, censor people that weren't online with the proper narrative. And it's not like Democrats were up in arms going, whoa, that's inappropriate. That's a line too far. We shouldn't be doing this. No. On the contrary, they were standing up saying, you need to do more of it. This is why these institutions should exist, because they're bad people spreading bad information. Of course, the government needs to intervene in order to censor that or restrict it for the public good. So again, I'm not claiming that your neighbor that you've known forever, that you have the occasional barbecue with, is some sort of wide-eyed neo-Marxist that's trying. What I'm saying is that they vote for the people that do these sort of things and allow these things to be possible. And from what I can tell, at least serving in a legislature, I know some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are not cool with everything that is going on, and not one of them will raise their voice against it. Not one of them will actually even vote against it because they know what will happen if they do. They know what will happen if they do. And so there's one, now we need to kind of transfer to something within this new dynamic because, again, we've talked a lot about how the right doesn't operate in a similar fashion. And part of that is due to a large philosophical disagreement with respect to the proper role of government. But one of the biggest detriments to leftist ideology has been when the very real consequences of those actions come home to roost, right? You can only keep people in a level of like desperation, poverty, whatever it is. We saw this within the Soviet Union. We saw this within, China. We saw this within Cuba. We've seen this within Venezuela. There's a certain threshold where it becomes so obvious that the regime keeps telling you they're doing this for your own good and nobody buys it anymore, right? And there have been two governors in particular, you could argue three, but two governors in particular that have been saying, okay, we're going to push back. I would say that's Abbott and DeSantis really has it down to something of an art form now. And one of the ways they started pushing back was when it came to illegal immigration. They started loading people on buses and they started sending them directly to the cities that were advocating for sanctuary policies, that were advocating for open borders, that were calling everybody else a racist. And they said, okay, here you go. This is what we've been dealing with on a day-to-day basis at the border. You now get to deal with it in your cities. And all of a sudden, you started to see something of an ideological shift by the citizens living in that city. What was fascinating is that when it came to the mayors, what did they do? They went, oh, it's racism. It's sexism. We need more money from the federal government in order to deal with this, right? At no point was it, oh gosh, now I see what you're talking about. This really is a significant problem. Maybe we should reevaluate our border policy. No, that wasn't it. It was just, once again, you're racist, you're sexist. But at the very least, and on some level, people who are willing, the people who have not accepted that it's perfectly fine going through life with a bunch of hypocrisy and contradictions in order to achieve political power, they started seeing it. They had to start to live with the consequences of these actions, and they started pushing back going, whoa, something is wrong here. Something is wrong here. The other thing that DeSantis has done, and this is something that you articulated early on, and this was something that you said, look, this is going to make my libertarian friends mad, but the bottom line is it's not good enough to just advocate for a libertarian society where you have low taxes, low regulations, and other than that, do what you want. That's not the society you live in. And quite frankly, if you don't actually take care of some of the social stuff, then you're going to create conditions to where leftists will flee places like California and New York because of high taxes and high regulations. They'll come to your low tax, low regulation state. And then the next thing you know, they're voting for the sort of politicians that put in the sort of policies that you hate and despise. And so what DeSantis started doing was, okay, we're going to provide the low taxes, we're going to provide the low regulations, but we're also going to go out, hey, Disney, you want to F around in Florida? We'll make sure you find out. And we'll remove some of that tax exempt status. You Democrats love taxes, right? Okay, here's some more of them because we're going to remove away your special privileges that you have over there in Orlando. And a lot of people on the right said, well, wait a second. Now you're using the government to target, an organization that you don't agree with politically. And the response from a lot of people on the right was, good. This is the way the game is played now. Now, I'm going to be honest, that was not my response.
Yeah, I know. This is where, and at some point, maybe you and I need to have a much deeper conversation about this because I don't know about you, but I have noticed that I've become way less libertarian over the last 4 years. And you've known me since I was in high school.
Yeah,
I used to be Mr. Libertarian, right? And I wouldn't
refuse to vote for Trump.
I didn't vote for Trump in 2020, and I got, man, when I revealed that in one of our previous episodes, I got dragged in the comments by a few people. Look, I'm voting for him this time. Okay, I at least I didn't vote for Joe Biden.
But what I'll say is that the interesting thing that's happened here, and this is kind of what and here's the other part I want people to understand. At least myself, I won't speak for Christian. I'm not advocating for a particular policy right here. I'm actually just analyzing what's going on and trying to make sense of why we got here.
Yeah.
And also trying to make sense of how do we hopefully save the country, right? There's some people that just got to the point where it's like, It's just time to fight, man. And I'm saying, look, I know what fighting looks like. I've been there, and I don't want that for my kids. I don't want that for my country. I want us to find a way to peacefully regain what it is that we've had. But I also know enough about history. I've seen war up front. I also know what happens when you get into these situations where, again, the primary purpose of achieving political power is to punish your political opponents. Because if you don't, they'll punish you. And once people have bought into that, there's a bit of a spiral there. And there's always a spiral. The question is how bad does it get? For how long? And are you capable of recovering?
There's a doom loop once it's just power politics, and it's just seize power and punish your political enemies. And unfortunately, that's how the left operates, which is why I think it's going to end really ugly. Like, have you ever read the quote from Frank Herbert, the guy who wrote the Dune novels? Mm-hmm. He's quoting somebody else in one of his books. And the line goes, "When I am weaker than you, I ask you for freedom because that is according to your principles. When I am stronger than you, I take away your freedom because that is according to my principles."
Yeah.
Like, that is the mindset that the left operates on.
I mean, it feels that way.
And it's getting to a point, and I'm not going to spoil what we were talking about before we recorded because we might actually do an episode on this, but I read you a couple quotes right before we started recording. And the reason why was because I was like, Nick, I got to read this to you because the very end of it, to me, it read like it came from you. Mm-hmm. And at the very end of this quote, it was a very famous quote. I won't spoil the context, but at the very end of the quote, this guy's warning people on the left that you are creating the circumstances through which people like me are going to be replaced with people who want to brutalize you because they've concluded that's how the game is played, and that there is no coexistence or compromise. One side must win. Mm-hmm. And if that's how it goes, then the violence that you have unleashed, the destruction that you have unleashed, will eventually be visited upon you one day.
Yeah.
And the way that the danger with all of that is that you eventually, if you go too far, you can create a doom loop where it's just everybody loses their liberty and you're just in chaos or anarchy or tyranny of some sort. And nobody really wants to live in a world like that. But you know what? If you have to choose between my side winning or us living in clown world forever, then increasingly you're going to get more and more people on the right. There's going to be like, I want to win. I don't want to lose. Nobody on the right wants to live in the type of world that we all know that we're heading towards. Yeah. Enough of the Hegelian dialectics. Why is it that every time something happens and the right objects to something, the press talks about, oh no, it's Republicans pounce. It's the right. It's the right's. The story is never the left's excesses. The story is always on the right's reaction to the left's excesses. Yeah. Well, eventually, we're seeing it in polling, the right's just going to stop caring what the press has to say. And so and we did an episode on this, right? Mm-hmm. One by one, all these institutions the left has captured, they're losing their luster. The right doesn't care about them anymore. No. In fact, the right wants to tear them down.
Well, that was my point on the floor. It was like, I don't care about like, you need to understand, you can get up and say all these accusations all day long. If you think they have some sort of impact on my thinking anymore, they don't. The words which used to have some degree of power, which used to make me a little bit more introspective with respect to what I said or my positions in order to try to consider a different perspective, I now know what you're using them for. They no longer have a fixed meaning. They have whatever meaning you need them to have in the moment to achieve your political objectives. You have manipulated the very tool that we use for peaceful negotiation in order to be served as a weapon against me. So no, I don't care what you say anymore. And that is actually a pretty dangerous place to be.
Yes, because the right is starting to conclude that the principles in the worldview and everything that they believe, right? The whole political philosophy of right-wing politics in the American tradition, which is built on classical liberalism. Mm-hmm. It is not right-wing tradition in the European sense.
Yeah.
Right? The American tradition of the right is now because there is a somewhat libertarian bent in that. Mm-hmm. Going all the way back to the Founding Fathers. The right is starting to conclude, rightly or wrongly, and I think in some ways actually rightly, although it's also a bit of a tragedy, is that their own principles and their own political philosophy are being used and exploited in order to crush them. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, what do you do? Well, some of them just double down and, put their heads in the sand, but others are like, well, I guess we got to reevaluate what we believe, or you know what, maybe we should stop focusing on theory and start focusing on outcomes, because it gets into the phrase, and we need to talk more about this, to be honest. The whole concept of the purpose of a system is what it does. Mm. not what it claims to be for, right? And so a good example of this is, to use like the economic sense, the purpose of the central bank is to facilitate money for government deficits. Now, what they claim the purpose of the central bank is, stable prices and full employment. No, the purpose of the central bank is debt monetization.
Yeah.
The purpose of the central bank is to facilitate funds for the federal government to spend on gender programs in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Right? Because the purpose of a system is what it does. And when you adopt that framework of looking at how political processes work or social institutions operate, what you end up ultimately concluding is that libertarianism is not a mechanism for you to win. It's actually a defeatist approach, because, it's something that I think you and Tim Pool actually brought up once when you were on his podcast. And Tim Pool said something along the lines of, for a long time, I was a free speech absolutist. And, the whole Voltaire line, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death, for your right to say it. And now I'm realizing that I'm defending to the death the right of people who, the second that they have the ability to do so, they will take my rights away from me. Mm-hmm. So you know what? I will happily oblige you. If you want free speech for everybody, I will defend it. Even if you disagree, is if you're consistent in your approach to, again, theory, philosophy, government approaches, if you're consistent in how you want to treat people, regardless of whether or not you're in power or I'm in power, if you actually do believe in this, then I will defend it. But if you hold the view that the second that I have political power, I'm going to oppress you and I'm going to take your rights away, then I will happily oblige you and I will take your rights away. Mm-hmm. And I will stop defending your freedom of speech the second that somebody comes after it. Yeah. What this is it's a post-liberal or post-libertarian approach to handling political debates. And I think that's the direction that the right is going, which is they're abandoning the traditional absolutist, look, we believe in the philosophy because the philosophy is good and it doesn't matter who's in charge. I will always defend the philosophy. And now they're realizing the philosophy is being used to bludgeon ourselves. And so, you know what? I'm done defending the right's freedom of speech because they won't respect mine. I'm done defending the rule of law because these people don't believe in the rule of law, because the second that they have control over federal law enforcement, they weaponize it against our political enemies. Okay, fine. You want to play that game? The second we're in charge, imagine what we're going to do with the FBI or the Attorney General's office or the DOJ or any of these federal agencies, because we've played this game that, these are supposed to be neutral institutions. You've now told us and shown us there is no such thing as a neutral institution. At first, there might be a neutral institution, but eventually one side will take over the institution and then weaponize it against their enemies and mold it into pushing a set narrative. Well, I don't want the cultural Marxists to be ruling all these institutions. I want conservatives to be ruling these institutions because I think conservatism provides the foundation for a stable and just society. So I'm not going to fight for neutral institutions anymore. I'm not going to fight for just bland philosophical universalist libertarianism where, again, I will defend your right to do whatever. Because guess what? You don't respect that type of stuff.
Tim Pool summarized it as, he goes, I used to believe I'll fight for your freedom of speech no matter what. Now I will fight for your freedom of speech provided you're someone that believes in freedom of speech. And if you don't, then I will honor your request by not defending your right to freedom of speech. And people are like, no, that's ridiculous. You have to fight for it regardless. Like, okay, that's like, again, to some degree, all you're doing is you're allowing for someone to operate and use a tool against you that was meant for both of your preservation, but now is being weaponized. And this is the part where I think that when you look at what Abbott and DeSantis are doing right now, Abbott and DeSantis are operating within the realm of traditional American discourse combined with federalism, which is to say, Florida has decided this is how we wish to live, and so we're going to live this particular way. And we're not trying to advocate that you impose it from the federal level, but we're saying that, again, this was the whole point. How does a large, constitutional republic exist beyond the small city-states and republics that used to exist in antiquity? And the answer was federalism. The answer is that the federal government has a relatively small list of things that they're responsible for. They focus on that. States, it's a lot more robust with respect to what they can or cannot do. And I feel like DeSantis and Abbott are operating, especially DeSantis is operating within that framework. It's like, this is what the people of Florida voted for. This is what they want. This is what we're going to do. They still are, again, there's still a great deal of respect for individual liberty and personal responsibility, right? It's not that they're forcing here's the amazing part. it's not that they're forcing the left to do things the left doesn't want to do. They're no longer subsidizing the things the left wants to do through the taxpayers or through government systems, and the left considers that persecution. Right? The left doesn't consider persecution when because stormtroopers have come in and said, oh, you're going to jail because you're gay. No, it's, you mean you're not going to subsidize our beliefs within the public school system? We're being persecuted. Like, well, wait a second. We're not subsidizing. Of course, now I think Florida's doing a chaplain program, but it's like we're not subsidizing religious services within the school system, right? And we don't think we're being persecuted. But again, that's the dynamic that they set, is that they will get the government to start to do something, fund something, whatever it is. And then the moment someone says, no, this isn't an appropriate role of government, it's, oh, we're being persecuted. And DeSantis' attitude is like, fine, the border's that way. Like, feel free to cross it and live somewhere else. And quite frankly, this is the part that I think is most terrifying to the left, because I don't see how the left actually wins out without massive government intervention on their behalf.
I don't see how they win out without us helping them win.
That's the point. Like, with the government intervention, the being able to take everybody's money and then give it to a university sitting on top of a $15 billion endowment so they can pay people $500,000 a year to run their DEI program. Like, that actually happened. That's UVA, right? So Democrats bragging about how much money they gave to higher education. That's right. They took your money, Mr. Plumber, Mr. Carpenter, Mr. Nurse. They took your money and gave it to an institution which is already sitting on top of a $15 billion endowment so that they could expand their DEI program within the university system, and then advocate for federal loan, student loan debt forgiveness, which basically means transferring the responsibility from paying it onto the person that took out the loan onto you, because the university already got their money. They already got their cut, right? That is what is going on. You take that away, and now all of a sudden they have to compete in the actual free market of ideas, where the person with 3 PhDs in gender studies can no longer justify their cush position within university, getting paid $300,000 a year to teach 4 classes. Where that person has to go out into the marketplace and actually provide something of genuine use and value to customers that can choose to do business with somebody else. That person doesn't have a job anymore. But nope. Politicians make sure that person is very, very safe, secure, and actually very well compensated for the purposes of using your tax dollars to create their future voters. So let's talk a little bit about, again, DeSantis is I think, operating within a realm that most conservatives would understand, and that most people that are traditionalists with respect to this is the proper process and there's certain lines we don't cross. I think he's doing a fairly good job of maintaining that line. Now, here's the question. Here's the final thing that we're going to go over today. What if Trump wins re-election? Having gone through all of these trials, having gone through all of these, and again, there may be certain things you don't like about Donald Trump. I'm sorry, but the sort of stuff they're going after him with, which is a deliberate attempt to just bankrupt him and make it impossible for him to run for office, that is a weaponization of the law against your political opponent. Now, Donald Trump ran in 2016 on lock her up, right? But we all kind of knew, hyperbolic political language, he's not going to really lock up Hillary Clinton, because in America, we don't try to use the law to destroy or imprison our political opponents. Well, if you're Donald Trump, that is not the world you occupy, man. You are very familiar with what it is to watch the federal government utilize its powers and municipal governments to utilize their powers in an attempt to destroy you because they don't like your politics. So you're president again. What do you do at that point? Now, legally, like what can you do within the current framework? Because we've talked about this before on kind of the juxtaposition between the chief executive in the United States versus the chief executive in Argentina, Javier Milei. Javier Milei actually has a great deal more power over his executive branch than Donald Trump has over his executive branch. It's not like Donald Trump can go in there and just clean house and get rid of federal agencies like Javier Milei did, or just fire tens of thousands of government employees. We have civil service laws in place to make sure that can't happen, right? So the question is, what does Trump actually do within the system as it exists, or what does he attempt to get away with?
I mean, I know what I would do.
What would you do? What would President Hines do if you had just gone through multiple?
Day one, I go to the entire White House press corps and I say, you are not invited on the grounds of the White House anymore. That's what you do at the very start.
So
First
you
hour.
throw out so President Hines would throw out the press corps.
Yeah,
all of
because
them.
no, the ones that are ideologically in my camp, I'll keep. But no,
So
I'm dead serious. Like Washington Post, no, you're not invited. You're in fact, yeah, hand in your pass. You're not going into the East room, the press room.
Good gosh,
like,
Christian.
New York Post, maybe you can stick around. Maybe Fox, even though I don't like them at all. But no, like NPR, CNN, MSNBC, Washington Post, no, they're the enemy. They are the enemy. They are my ideological enemies. Why on earth am I going to give good faith interviews to my enemies? So no, you don't get a seat. In fact, I don't need you anyway because we have things like the internet. We have YouTube and Twitter that I could communicate directly to the American people.
But you see the difference. There's a difference between throwing everybody out and throwing only your ideological.
I know,
enemies
and there's
out.
a reason why
right,
I would do that. So that's the first thing I would do within the first hour.
So you are advising Donald Trump on what he should do. That's what we're gonna do.
He needs.
You advise Trump, and then I'm going to advise Trump.
He needs to explicitly tell the enemy, and they are the enemy. The overwhelming, and it is incredible that we've gotten to this point because they were never supposed to be the enemy, but the overwhelming majority of journalists are enemies of free people in the United States right now. They have become utterly ideologically captured by the left and become weaponized against us. Why on earth would we communicate with them? You've brought up the same thing about like why talk to any of these newspapers like the Washington Post when you have a larger circulation on your Instagram than they do. You don't need to talk to them. So that's the first thing I would do within the first hour is make it clear who's going to be invited into the White House for press conferences and who's not.
Okay.
The second thing is I would push the envelope as far. In fact, I would push it beyond as far as you could go. Even if it would trigger a constitutional crisis, I would push it as far as I could physically.
On what?
When it came to firing the blob of the federal bureaucracy, I would do to the federal bureaucracy what Elon Musk did to Twitter. And the reason why is because they're the enemy. There's something to be said about where the nature of power is. We think that we live in a democracy, a representative democracy, right? Yeah. We think that the way that the system works, or at least the way the system's supposed to work, is that we vote for representatives who go to Washington, D.C. and represent us. And they vote on legislation. They decide policy. They create law. They construct the legal system of this country based on our wishes. And we express our wishes through a peaceful democratic system in order to elect those officials to do so. All the way from the House of Representatives to the U.S. Senate to the presidency itself, right? We think that that's how power flows in this country, that it's vested in the people and that it's manifested through our elected representatives. That is not at all how power flows in this country right now, because the president and Congress ultimately have almost no power because they've handed over all of that power to the federal bureaucracy. And so the overwhelming majority of power, and I mean actual power, I don't fear my congressman. I fear federal law enforcement. I fear federal regulatory agencies. Did I elect any of those people? No. I don't fear Abigail Spanberger. No, but I do fear the IRS agent. I do fear the EPA agent. You and I have worked together when I worked in your office in Richmond, your first session, and we had a constituent that was having to fight state-level bureaucracy in order to build, like, I think it was like a brewery or something like that in Orange County. They didn't fear you. They feared the bureaucracy that they didn't elect. They elected you, right? Because you were their representative. They could communicate with you, and you did everything you possibly could to help your constituents. That's the way the system's supposed to work. But no, they weren't afraid of that. They were afraid of the unelected bureaucrats that were going to come in and find them if they tried to build a business on their own land. And so the way that power currently works in this country, and this is a huge problem, is that it's not vested in the White House. It's not vested in Congress. It's vested in federal law enforcement and federal agencies that are unelected. So the second thing I would do after I
wait. So you made the argument for the problem with the current federal bureaucracy, and you said if you said what Elon Musk did to Twitter, Elon Musk he got rid of 75% of Twitter. So you're advising Donald Trump get rid of 75% of federal agencies.
Yeah, tell them you're not welcome. Do not show up on Monday. You don't have a job. And then if they sue, ignore the court rulings. If it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, say, oh, that's great. Is Justice Roberts going to come to the door and physically open it on Monday?
So you're going to do the Andrew Jackson, you've made your decision, let's see you enforce it.
We are at a point where I genuinely think that the only way that you can truly save this country without a massive, unprecedented political upheaval that nobody would ever want to see is if we get somebody into the White House that pushes it to the breaking point. And again, I mean pushes the envelope as far as possible, which is I know what the problem is. I know where power is vested. The people did not want this power the people wanted power vested in me and in Congress because that's who they elected. They did not elect the EPA. They didn't elect the FBI.
Okay,
they didn't elect any of those.
Okay, listen, I get.
Yeah.
I get the philosophical argument that you're making right now. I think it's very compelling. My question is, though, is that there's a big difference between, hey, Trump, wouldn't it be neat if you could actually fire 75% of the federal bureaucracy? You can't. So when you tell 75% of the federal bureaucracy, go home, the bureaucracy doesn't just throw up their hands and say, oh, I guess we got to go home. No, they show up. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to have the other half of the federal bureaucracy show up and prevent them from like occupying the building?
Yes.
And are they going to comply with that? Or are they going to look at it as a violation of civil service laws? You see what I mean? Like I get
That's
in
why
theory,
I said you push it, you push the envelope as far as you can go.
But then here's the problem. What happens? Like this famous saying in politics, right? When you try to kill the king, you better cut the head off. Mm-hmm. And so the point is if you're going after the federal bureaucracy, which you're saying is king, and I tend to be very sympathetic to that interpretation, simply saying you're done, and then saying I'm going to have, whatever it is, the FBI, or I'm going to have whatever other federal law enforcement agencies I can use to potentially do this, bar the doors and not let you in. What happens if the federal law enforcement agencies see that as, well, no, I'm not going to comply with this?
I mean, if you want to go as far as possible, that's when you as the president reach out to DeSantis, Abbott, other red state governors, and you say, please come to D.C.
What does that mean?
Please help me clean house and empty out the federal bureaucracy.
Okay, but what does that mean?
What I mean is that you call upon the people that voted you into office.
Yeah.
Because you don't just fight this fight yourself,
sure.
right? You tell them something like, guess what? Stop paying your taxes.
Yeah.
As the president. I seriously mean, I mean, like, okay, the bureaucracy wants to exist in spite of the fact that the people elected somebody to office who promised to clean house.
Yeah.
I tried to close the doors. Whatever court ruling, civil service laws, they try to argue, they find some legal way to do it. I ignore the court rulings because, again, I'm going to push this as far as I can go.
Yeah.
And if they still force the doors open, I direct the Treasury Department to stop cutting the paychecks. Yeah. If they have some sort of court ruling to do that, to force the Treasury Department to start cutting the paychecks, then I go to my red state governors and I say, tell your residents to stop paying federal income tax.
But then, okay, I get that.
And the reason why is because you starve you make it irrelevant.
Yeah.
As the president, and you can give some air of legitimacy to it because you are the president, right? Go to them and be like, I'm not going to come after you, and I will tell federal law enforcement to not come after you. Help me, help you kill the Leviathan. Mm-hmm. Because we either put an end to this right now, or the second, I mean, because it's like you said, it's you either, if you aim for the king, you better not miss, right? We got 4 years to do this. Maybe 8. Well, if you're Trump, you've only got 4, right?
Yeah.
You've got 4 years to do this. Maybe 8 if you can get somebody in after him, but that's a big if. You have 4 years to do this. And if we lose now, we probably lose everything because
let me
the second that they come back in, they're going to realize that we are actually reacting rather than just simply complaining about what if the roles were reversed. And then they will brutalize us the second they're back in charge. We have 4 years to clean house and fix this problem. And if it requires going to unprecedented steps in order to do so, it's a risk that we have to take because we either do it now or we do it when they're in charge and we know where things are going to head. So nobody wants that.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to tell you. Here's what the bureaucracy will do, right? If now, again, the most extreme is when you actually have a breakdown of the chain of command. And now your federal law enforcement or your military or whoever else you could potentially use as chief executives that refuses to enforce your orders, which is like, okay, on what level would they come to that conclusion? Well, I think they would come to that conclusion if Congress. So let's say you got President Trump, but you've got a Democrat House of Representatives. They're going to say like, well, no, we're the ones that do the budget and you can veto the budget, but we're going to pass the budget. And
do they have a veto-proof majority?
Well, no. The point that you need, no. Here's what I need you to understand, right? They're not going to say. I honestly think the left would relish something like this, and the reason why is because they're going to come in and say we tried to pay these people. The bureaucracy is not going to stop collecting taxes. What they're going to stop doing is cutting Social Security checks, and then they're going to say, well, in keeping with the order of the President of the United States, we're no longer allowed. just hear me out. I heard you out. They're going to start doing they're going to make it as painful as possible on the voting public, not themselves, right? That's who they're going to make it very, very painful on. And then if you've got Congress contradicting what the president is saying, if you've got the Supreme Court contradicting what the president is saying, now you create critical mass for federal agencies to be, we are now in a position where, yes, the president of the United States is technically our boss, but he seems to be operating in a fashion which is unconstitutional. I'm not obligated to follow orders which violate X, Y, and Z, right? We're not even talking about legal justification. We're talking about moral justification, right? Because again, the bureaucracy wants to exist, right? The bureaucracy, I guess what I'm pointing out here is the bureaucracy cannot be seen as a willing partner in the destruction of itself. And so the question so how do you deal with this? Well, how did our founders deal with competing powers? They pitted one power against another power. See, my belief is that if you go after everything all at once, sometimes you run into problems. The question is how do you articulate what you're going to do and how you're going to do it in such a way to where the bureaucracy becomes a willing partner in what you're trying to do. And so, and you got to remember, you can't lose you can't lose the House, the Senate, and the judiciary in the process. Because then what you're going to do is you're going to give practical legitimacy to your opposition. So if you really want to do something where you're cutting into federal bureaucracy, I think there's ways that you can do it, but it's all about how you manage that and what actually takes place. Like, how are funds getting redistributed, right? What is, again, somebody's ox is getting gored, right? How do you make sure it's the right people? and this is the part where I think it is more complex. Because again, we can't just look at the bureaucracy as a willing participant in its own destruction. It will fight to save itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we view it that way, all of a sudden we understand that, okay, there's a way to do this, but we got to be somewhat careful.
I totally agree that it will fight to save itself. But like I said earlier, that is where power is. This is actually something that the neo-reactionaries have pointed out with their concept of formalism.
Yeah.
And this is why a lot of neo-reactionaries are monarchists or closet monarchists or want some sort of like corporate style system.
Almost kind of like this Holy Roman Empire thing. So we got an elected president.
It depends on the type of neo-reactionary, because some will be like, oh yeah, we want an HRE style system because there's also a lot of tradition imbued in there. Yeah. And then there's others that have this like techno-futurist sense.
Corporate CEO.
Because and the thought process goes something like this. Power exists. The ring exists.
Yeah.
We want power to be formalized as much as we possibly can. And what that means is that everybody knows where power is vested. There's a clear chain of responsibility where there's no confusion about who wields the power or anything like that. Everybody knows that Tim Cook calls the shots at Apple.
Yeah.
Everybody knows that the King of France is the King of France. We're talking pre-revolution, right? That he's the King of France.
Yeah.
That power is vested in the monarchy or power is invested in the CEO. Now, you can still have checks and balances within that system. I mean, even within pre-revolutionary France, the nobility were a check on, and the individual parliaments were a check on, like the States General were a check on the monarchy. Likewise, the board at Apple is a check on the CEO because they appoint the CEO. But there's the only amount of, in a free market system, consider the fact that the amount of bureaucracy, most of the bureaucracy at Apple exists because of federal laws requiring things like HR departments and stuff like that, and other aspects like DEI requirements and ESG scores, coming from BlackRock and stuff like that. But the bureaucracy that exists at Apple, as a percentage of the entirety of Apple, is minuscule compared to the bureaucracy that exists within the federal government. Yeah. It's much more streamlined because it's the free market. Likewise, the bureaucracy in pre-revolutionary France is minuscule compared to what type of bureaucracy we have today. And so the concept of formalization, what it means is that we want power to be formalized in those who should be wielding it rather than those who we think actually have it but actually really don't. And the power is instead formalized in a bureaucracy that nobody elects. Nobody can name any of these people. Nobody knows who these people are. They're nameless, faceless blobs in the system. But that's where the power is invested in. Again, like, I don't fear Joe Biden. I fear all the individual alphabet agencies. Yeah. And so what we want, we know what the problem is. The problem is actually, it's not Joe Biden. The problem is also not the Democratic Congress, because ultimately those institutions, they should have the power, but they don't.
I still say they're problems, but go ahead.
They're problems insofar as they contributed to the mess that we are currently in.
Sure.
Right? But the perpetuation of the mess is now coming out of the federal bureaucracy. And so what we need is a formalization of power. What we need far more power invested in the hands of Congress and the presidency, and far less power invested in the bureaucracy.
So I don't disagree with that. Again, the question is how do you get to all that, and what will? So I think Trump's going to come in. I think Trump's going to go after civil service law, and I think he can do so effectively, provided he has a Congress that's willing to work with him. What they need to understand is that without a Republican House and a Republican Senate, everything dies in one of those bodies. Everything dies in one of those bodies. And that's the part where people will get frustrated and they will demand that he does something in addition to that, right? So I think Trump will come in, and I don't think he's going to lock up Hillary. I don't think he's going to lock up every DA that went after. I don't think he's going to do that. I think he recognizes that the federal bureaucracy is a major source of the problems. He will try to go after civil service law. He will probably not going to be able to get that through Congress because the Democrats will control one of those branches. At that point, what is the creative thing that he does? Now, your answer is like, hey, you're fired. Don't show up to work tomorrow. Again, that's problematic. Now I will say this. If you're trying to operate within like murky legal waters on what the president can do and what the president can't do, one of the things that I think would be, let's just say, an interesting thought exercise is that if he did like a pretty comprehensive audit, right? And I'm not talking about one that takes 2 years. I'm like, comprehensive audit has to be done in 4 months. Comes back, looks at everything, looks at all of like the things that are truly essential. Like these are the things that absolutely need, the Social Security checks need to get cashed or cut, or you're going to have a voter revolution on your hands, right? But there's a lot of other spending out there that the general public, it could go away tomorrow. The general public would not feel anything. In fact, there's agencies that could go away tomorrow and their lives would improve and they wouldn't know why, right? So that's the thing, is like you do a tiered system within the federal bureaucracy of what is the most obnoxious part of this federal bureaucracy that people in general don't have a good view of. And that's where you start targeting. And then for some of these others, now, if they don't let you target it, I would even go so far as to do this. I would say, okay, fine. I can't fire you. I have to pay you, but I can prevent you from working. Right? So great. Here's your paycheck. Go stay at home. And initially people are going to be furious. Why are they? Well, I can't fire them. Well, then why aren't they doing something? Have you noticed how your life is better when they're not working? Right now, you're paying them to not screw with your life. And it's better than when you were paying them to screw with your life. So significant portions of the EPA, significant portions of the IRS, significant portions of other federal agencies that we're not sure why they exist. Why do we need this many people? The Department of Energy. Like, why does the Department of Education need a SWAT team, right? Like going through all of that and saying, yeah, we're getting rid of this, right? Now, I was going to take that money, and here's what I was going to spend it on. I was going to spend it on fixing the border problem. I was going to spend it on fixing this over here. I was going to spend this on tax cuts for people that are working hard to make ends meet. But I can't. I got to pay these people, but it is that much better. It is worth it to pay them to sit at home than it is to have them show up at work. That's the sort of part where I think you get a voter dynamic, you get a paradigm shift within the voter base, which says, wait a second. 50,000 federal bureaucrats are not able to show up to work. They're still getting paid. And not only has my life not been made worse, it's been made better as a result of this. Why do they exist? And now that makes it so much harder, because what is Congress going to say? Oh, well, these hardworking public, servants. Okay, well, I'm telling you right now, the mom that is going to the grocery store, putting in her ATM card, praying to God that somehow, by some miracle, there's enough money to pay for the groceries that she used to be able to easily afford 2 years ago. She doesn't want to hear about the hardworking public service, person at the EPA that spent their entire time telling somebody why you couldn't build more housing. That ain't a thing, man. That ain't a thing. And so part of this is about this is working within your legal framework that you have, respecting the legal framework, and so but now, are they going to sue? Absolutely. But now if they're suing, and some circuit court judge, some federal appointee somewhere in Vermont is like, well, technically you can't. That's the part where you could look like, yeah, well, technically we don't agree. We're going to keep appealing to the Supreme Court. Oh, well, I'm doing an injunction. That's cute. Right. Well, we're just going to do what Joe Biden did when it came to transferring student loan debt on from the people that took out the loans onto hardworking Americans. We're just going to continue to find little ways that we can do it, and we're going to force you to challenge every single one in court. But we're doing this.
Like I said, you get to a point where here's the problem. There is no limitation on power that the left respects. There's none. They don't even respect their own limitations on power. This is why you're constantly seeing left-wing civil wars where they're ejecting members of their own coalition because they no longer serve a purpose.
Yeah.
And so how do you work with those type of people? You don't. How do you coexist with those type of people? You don't.
Well, the point is that I'm trying to avoid, look, I'm not trying to jump to the end here, which is, we all just fight in the streets. Like, I don't want that. I'm trying to say, what are the ways? Because again, you have some people on this side that are absolutely committed to one thing. You have some people on this side that are absolutely committed. You have a lot of people that just want to be able to pay for the groceries, and they're not quite sure why they're so expensive. Elizabeth Warren says it's greed. We say it's the Federal Reserve inflating the currency. All I know is I can't pay for my groceries. And the question is what sort of mechanism are you creating to demonstrate just how bad this bureaucracy has gotten? Because the point you make is a very good one. About I actually think that if you were to line up the American people in general, right, they would have the least amount of sympathy for federal bureaucrats that are imposing rules, restrictions, fines, fees, like they are paying for the privilege of having their lives being made worse. And that is a really difficult sell when people are struggling, if they can properly associate the source of the problem. And I think there's a huge opportunity for Trump to firmly, and then again, because what are all the people that love the bureaucracy going to do? Again, Elizabeth Warren's going to jump up there and talk about our brave and courageous and hardworking public servants, and everybody that's been to the DMV is going to be like, yeah, don't think so. Right? I'm not saying that some of these organizations maybe shouldn't exist, but you don't get to tell me when I got treated the way I did at the DMV, which is a state institution, I know. You don't get to tell me how I got treated by the DMV. You don't get to tell me how the IRS treated me the last time I interacted with them. You don't get to tell me how the last time OSHA or the EPA or somebody else treated me when we were trying to build more affordable housing. You don't get to tell me that's the hardworking public servant making $60,000 a year in a job they can't be fired of no matter how incompetent they are. You don't get to tell me that's my primary concern.
The problem is, and I've told you this before, like the hour is late.
Sure.
We are, I mean, think about it from just an economic perspective. We're spending more on interest on the debt than we are in the military.
Yeah.
This is the first year ever that we will spend $1 trillion on interest payments.
Well, and I don't disagree, but can we also agree that one of the biggest things that I think what James Lindsay has talked about, actually Rudyard from What If Alt His has talked about, he goes, the biggest mistake that the right can make at this point is if they move so fast that it challenges all of their moral legitimacy with respect to what they're doing.
I get that, but like I'm dooming really hard in my head right now, and because I know what's coming if we allow the debt crisis to get to where it is currently headed.
Sure.
We have maybe one more shot to prevent the inevitable from happening, or prevent the inevitable from becoming inevitable. And it is to gut the federal bureaucracy before the sovereign debt crisis kicks in. Because again, I don't think people understand how quickly it will get bad. It is a exponential curve in terms of interest spent, because every single dollar in interest that's being put to, or dollar in federal spending that's being put towards interest is having to be borrowed in order to pay for pre-existing debt, which means it'll be an exponential curve.
You're paying one credit card with another credit card.
Yes, you're taking on multiple credit cards with higher interest rates in order to pay off the previous ones. And it'll be a very quick amount of time. It'll seem like, oh man, it seemed like yesterday that it was only $1 trillion. Now it's $2 trillion. Now it's $5 trillion.
Yeah.
Now the amount of interest on the debt eclipses all federal revenues.
Yeah.
At that point, there's no coming back, right? You will go into a sovereign default of one way or another, either hyperinflation or just straight up default. And they're not going to default; they will print, and that's when you get hyperinflation, and then you do turn into Weimar Germany. Right?
Yeah.
Like, and I don't mean the end of the Republic. I mean the beginning of it, right? 1920s Weimar Germany.
Yeah.
That's bad because, I mean, there were coup attempts. Everybody leaves this out.
Well,
like there were takeover attempts by the socialists and communists. There were takeover attempts by right-wing groups long before Hitler, right, in Weimar Germany. That is bad. You do not want that. And I mean, look at what's happened to Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Argentina for that matter. Argentina's the one bright spot, right? Because at least they got Malay.
But they also had to go through like 70 years of Peronis.
Who wants to go through 70 years of Peronis before you get a Malay? And so, like, if those are our options, just complete disintegration of society or of the central government, and you just get Weimar everywhere, Argentina everywhere, nobody wants that. And so, like, we have one shot to prevent this. And I'm also trying to avert a actual blow up. I don't want to see fighting in the streets, but you know what? Well, we'll guarantee fighting in the streets. Weimar guarantees fighting in the streets.
No, listen, I don't disagree that if you actually end up with a sovereign debt crisis, that's where you're at. I think we're a little bit more resilient than, but I get it. Like I'm not discounting what you're saying. I think we've got a little bit more runway, and I think we've got more mechanisms in order to do it. I don't think it's a one shot and this is going to decide it all. Like I'm just not there yet, because I do believe that there's a lot more resiliency baked into our system than there was in Germany.
There was resiliency back when we lived in a system where both the Democrats and the Republicans, or the left and right, respected certain constitutional and legal and societal norms. When this was Tip O'Neill negotiating with Ronald Reagan, if we had a sovereign debt crisis in the 1980s, we could survive it as a country. A Democrat like Tip O'Neill and a Republican like Ronald Reagan could come together, and there might be terrible policies that we would disagree with.
Yeah, but they would figure it out without disintegration.
And the country would not fall apart, and people wouldn't be fighting in the streets. It would be difficult. It'd be tough. There might be protests, or there might be people upset about tax hikes or cuts, spending cuts or whatever it is, but we could get through it as a country. Tip O'Neill is not in the House of Representatives anymore. This is not your father's or your grandfather's or your great-grandfather's Democratic Party. We now live in a system where they do not respect any limitations on power, and they will use any crisis, never let a crisis go to waste, right? They will use any crisis in order to attain power and punish brutally their enemies. Why? Because we're evil and we're bad guys, and we deserve to be brutalized and punished. And so if something like this happens, and it will happen unless drastic measures are taken to stop it, if something like this happens, the second they get back in, they will wreck the system. And then at that point, we're not talking about Weimar. We're talking about Spain, 1936. And that's an even worse situation than 1920s Germany. Nobody wants that. And so I'm operating under the idea, and I think it's not even an idea. I think it's absolutely true that we have missed multiple opportunities to deal with this crisis. And look, many of them are the fault of Republicans.
Oh, yeah,
they have been.
Absolutely.
The whole concept of the uniparty, that is a thing. And the Republicans have been operating like controlled opposition for so long. And so I get that. But we have missed so many opportunities to address this problem that we're running out of time. And if we do not gut the federal bureaucracy in order to address this crisis before it blows up, there won't be many other options left that aren't ugly, and nobody wants that. And so we've got to do something. This is why I say, if Trump gets in, he needs to push the envelope if he wants to avert catastrophe. And I hope that he has realized how he's been treated over the past 4 years. Well, really over the past 8 years, almost a decade now. I hope that he would understand that how he's been treated is indicative of what will happen if he doesn't do what needs to be done and take power away from those systems and institutions that have been weaponized against him. If anything else, his own self-interest should play into this, but it shouldn't just be that. It should be the interest of our country, because, again, the hour is late, Nick, and you know it. We've talked about this at length. We're running out of time here, and unfortunately, we're not negotiating with rational actors who might disagree with us on what the top marginal tax rate should be. We're dealing with irrational zealots who they've already shown us their true colors, and you can't work with those people, unfortunately. I wish you could. I wish that we were dealing with a bunch of Tip O'Neills, but we're not.
Well, look, I think, again, I don't disagree that we've gone down this path way too long, and that there's a certain amount of pain you're going to have to go through to get through it. Because you can't have this much debt. Plus, you can't have a major political party. And again, I don't know how many times I have to caveat this, but I think it's important. I know a lot of Democrats who don't believe that they need to use the federal bureaucracy to punish all of their political opponents. The problem is that I don't see a lot of them running the show, right? And they're certainly not in the ascendancy within their own party. They feel like they need to be quiet And they need to at least give some sort of overtures to the sort of people that absolutely want to use the federal bureaucracy to punish their political opponents. And so the bottom line is that if even if you're in a position of, quote unquote, power or position, and you can't actually use it to advocate against your own side with respect to what they're doing, well, then what good is it? At some point, you're just marking time until you're eventually replaced with somebody more radical than you. And that has essentially been the process that's been taking place right now on the left. And I've seen it within the General Assembly to some degree. The other thing I'll say is this, though. I do believe that Rudyard's right, that Lindsay's right, that if the left can bait the right into trying to move too quickly in a direction that robs them of any legitimacy within a certain portion of the population, which is sympathetic, then that's going to be how they win, because I don't believe the left can fight for themselves at this point outside of the massive federal bureaucracy, because they haven't exactly garnered a warrior spirit within the left, right? The modern woke left is not the communists of old. It's not the socialists of old that actually held up masculinity as a positive thing and expected men to go forward and do their duty and tame the wilderness and fight the wars. Right? No, it's the person dressed as a cat saying, I'm going to join the military because I know my cat-like reflexes will be great in combat. That person ain't winning any wars, man. Right? So they do have to try to hold on to some of this, and they do need to try to bait us into doing something stupid, which causes people that are capable of fighting to say, yeah, I agreed with some of what you were saying, but I can't go along with that. And that's the point, right? I don't want things to get to a position where we're fighting one another. I would like cooler heads to be able to prevail on the left. I don't see it happening because the last 10 years, I've been watching it closely. It hasn't moved in that direction. There have been very few indications to me that it was actually going to move back in a direction where there was something, attributable to either more civil discourse or genuine respect for American institutions and history. And so here's where we're at. The question is, because Christian brought this up, and this is going to be a little bit of a teaser to our next episode. The question is why is it that even when Republicans have power, I'm old enough to remember a world where Donald Trump had the presidency and Republicans controlled the House and the Senate. And yet we weren't able to do any of the things that we ran on, much less going after a massive federal bureaucracy, which in large portion controls power in a way that I don't think our founders anticipated, and I don't think most Americans are actually comfortable with, regardless of where they may sit on the political spectrum. So the question is, why didn't we? The question is why does Mike Johnson, the current Speaker of the House, why is he now passing budgets that we would have been furious at Kevin McCarthy for passing? Why is that taking place? And there's been a question that has come up recently, and it's been coming up more and more frequently, and that is, Mike Johnson, you're voting in a way that your previous voting record would have never indicated. Blink SOS if they're holding you hostage. And I think more people are starting to wonder, is this just something where the federal bureaucracy has gained so much power, and because they will protect their own power and their own existence, what are they willing to do? Not just in the future if something goes bad, not just if you have a president that's willing to fight back. What are they currently willing to do? Because the bottom line is if you can control the right committee chairs in Congress, I promise you, your budget ain't going anywhere. You might get some performative stuff. You might get some investigations. You might get some analysis or maybe a study that was conducted in order to try to find greater efficiencies, but you're not losing any real power. And that has been the general trajectory of the federal bureaucracy for decades now. So this begs the question. I don't believe that everybody in the federal government, I used to work in the federal government. I was a soldier for 11 years, right? I certainly don't believe that every FBI agent or every soldier or everybody working in the State Department is a horrible person. I don't believe that all of those positions should go away tomorrow. I don't believe that. I believe that there's room for some federal agencies and some federal bureaucracy. But I also believe that it has grown to a degree that is absolutely obscene. And I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that maybe certain people within those federal bureaucracies, certain people within those intelligence agencies might be willing to do certain things in order to make sure that that power remains unchecked. And so the question that we're going to go over next episode is, have we gotten to a point where our members of the legislature, our members of the executive branch, the elected members, or maybe even some of the appointed ones, are they actually afraid? of the federal bureaucracy and what it can do to them, not just professionally, but personally, if they get out of line. So that will be our next episode. Thank you very much for hanging along for this one. We hope it was kind of an interesting and robust discussion on the topic of, will there be a retaliation? What could it potentially look like? Is there an appropriate legal and constitutional way to do it? Or is it just something where you've got to force the issue the way the issue seems to be being forced upon us? So thank you very much for joining us. Please leave us some comments. Let us know how you think we did, whether or not we actually answered any questions you might have had on this topic. And we look forward to seeing you next episode.